Hi, and welcome to today's video where I will be talking about the steps you should take when you are given a project. In this video, I'll cover key areas such as your initial scope, your stakeholder management, risk, issues, project planning, finance. I'll cover in a very brief outline, but these are the key steps I feel as a project manager you need to take before you start your project. Now, first one is understanding project scope. Now, you need to get a clear, defined project scope statement is crucial. This is where you have a clear understanding of what you are going to deliver, which will also prevent scope creep. Now, scope creep is where you start with the original destination. However, you end up weaving through your project and end up in a different location than anticipated without real governance. Now, that's what you want to try and avoid. Now, you can go in a different direction with proper governance, but you want to avoid doing something off the cuff without some real controls. So that's really important. The scope creep is one thing you want to try and avoid. So firstly, define the scope, get clear project scope statements, define all the key deliverables, milestones, and constraints. Secondly, set out the clear boundaries. What are those boundaries? Determine the boundaries of what's included in the project, what's in and what's out of scope. Be really key. What is going to actually be delivered, and confirm and document what is also out of scope. And again, finally, agree on deadlines. Get agreement from stakeholders of realistic project deliverable deadlines and milestones that must be achieved. There could be dependencies on other phase one of your project being delivered because it has a dependency on another element of your project. And that's really key. So you need to do that and make sure you've got that done. Step two is identifying your stakeholders. Now, really, any project you are given, you need to understand who are your stakeholders from all levels, from senior C-suite all the way down to your juniors, whatever they may be. They have a role to play within your projects. So firstly, gather info on the project goals, stakeholders, deliverables that they constrain you. So you have a clear understanding. Then map out your stakeholders' roles and responsibilities and their expectations so that you have a clear understanding of what their role and what part they play within your project. Now, Racy Matrix is a good method to do that, or simply just having a conversation with your team will allow you to list out your stakeholders, identify what they do, what role they play, and when they need to take part with your projects. So the next one is identify stakeholders' interests and influences. What interests do they have within your project, and why would they want to partake, and what influence do they have? So if you've got a senior stakeholder who's in charge of your finances and releases money at the right time, that's a different kind of interest in your project. Whereas an engineer who's delivering your project for you has a different level of interest because it's a different subset. So identifying that is really key. And finally, really connect with your stakeholders and really start engaging with them. Have that rapport. As a project manager, you need to build that rapport and understand what their needs are and manage your stakeholders. People have different push and pull activities in their life. You as a project manager need to manage your stakeholder so that you can understand how you get the best out of them at the right time when you need them. So I'm going to say a statement here which Stephen Covey said, begin with the end in mind. Now here, with any kind of project, think about what your journey is going to be. Start from the end. How do you start from the end and work your way back to determine how your project is going to pan out? That helps you do all your planning and step by step saying, okay, we need to do this first. We find out your dependencies, your stakeholders. We find out any blockers, any time when you can't deliver, people aren't available, all those things, but always start with the end in mind so that you end up understanding what you're trying to achieve, and always reference the end every so often throughout your project. Do not forget what the end goal is. Now, the end goal may change because the business has changed or the direction has changed, but understanding that end goal will help you drive your project in the right direction. Next is develop a project plan. Now, here is where you outline all the key activities. Now, here, step by step, you will be outlining what activities are needed to get things done, Do you break your project down into work streams? I personally like doing work streams. Some people like to do sequential, which I find a little bit more confusing. But ideally, do your work streams, understand what that work stream requires to get delivered. That work stream then you assign your resources and the amount of effort and time, which gives you a clear steer of how much effort is needed to deliver. However, the overall plan will give you some clear indication of whether you're going to meet your deadline or you're not, and if there's issues, how you can best manage things. It also helps you look ahead, which is really key. Remember the end in sight. If the project plan is fully completed as best as you can, don't forget, your plan will change as it goes along, but having something as a baseline will help you get there. For your project plan, it's really key understanding the activities, how much time and effort, who will do it, and when it will happen, and any dependencies that are needed against each activity are really key. Next is defining your roles within the project. So what are your individual roles? So this really fits in with your stakeholder. Once you've identified your stakeholders, I mentioned it earlier, use RACI to determine what everybody's role is within the business. So you have a senior stakeholder, what is their role within your project delivery? You have an engineer, what's their role? You have an accounts team, what's their role? Marketing team, what will they do? There might be development team, there might be field engineers, or whatever it may be. Understand what their role is within your project. And speak to your people, just communicate to them, talk to them, understand what's going on is really key. Just understand that. And then I would review your RACI matrix on a regular basis too. And if you're not familiar with RACI, RACI stands for Responsible, Accountable, Consultative, Informed. 4 elements. You identify who's responsible, who's accountable, who you consult, and who you inform for each activity or responsibility within the project, depending on how you wish to use it. But defining the roles is really going to help you understand what part they play within your project. Next is your communication method or protocol, whichever way you want to put it. How are you going to communicate with your team? What methods are you going to use? What the frequency? You can use tools like email, instant messaging. You can write reports, whatever it may be. What's your frequency? Will you do it daily as needed? And in today's day, one of the things I've noticed is that people do not physically talk to each other. Everything's done on Teams, chats, or emails. All good tools, and they have their part to play. However, when you have a face-to-face conversation, it is so important that sometimes you build that rapport and you also build bridges, which is really key. However, having some sort of communication plan, frequency of your meetings, frequency of your stand-ups, time that you do it, you need to make sure that you've got all your stakeholders built into that communication strategy so that you get the best out of them and that you address issues and concerns with your team. Next is risk management. Here, you're going to start looking at identifying your potential risks. Speak to your team. You're doing the work are the ones who will really help you here. You are not expected as a project manager to know everything. So tap into your resources. Again, then you will reduce your project uncertainties. Make sure trying to mitigate the risk. Do you accept it, or do you sit onto a third party, whatever that may be? You will need to look at that. Conduct risk assessment regularly. Now, I do this in many of my projects. I do this on a weekly basis just to go through stuff, and I do it as part of our team meeting. So that really helps. And then the strategies, you need to work on strategies to mitigate and identify risks. So how are you going to do it? Are you going to do it daily? Are you going to talk to it? How do you review those risks? Do you do it on a team call? I would just go step-by-step process. Identify the risk, use your team to understand the severity of the risk, what impact it will have. How are we going to mitigate it? Do we accept it? Do we pass it on to a third party? Or is it low risk, high risk? Whatever it may be, put it in some sort of category and then put a mitigation saying, how are we going to avoid the risk? Sometimes you just accept it and say, we're just going to have to accept the risk. Sometimes you can say, I can avoid the risk and sometimes you can pass it on to the third party and say, actually, it's not for us to worry about. It's a third party responsibility. They need to manage it. And then finally, make sure you have an owner for that risk. So somebody takes ownership and manages it throughout the life cycle. So somebody's accountable for ensuring that risk is maintained. Next is securing your resource, or really firstly, identifying the personnel you need, which will feed into your project plan, list the technical requirements so that you can understand what's needed within your project. So firstly, when I say identify your personal needs, I would say, what the roles, responsible needed for that project, who's needed, what type of engineer, what type of person needs to be doing this activity, and then assign the resource accordingly and then request it. Then you also need to make sure you've got detailed hardware, software, list of technical requirements, all those things that you might need to deliver your product, what physical items, and not just technical. If you're building a bridge, for example, what items will you need to make sure that you can actually physically construct it, i.e. cement, ropes, or whatever it may be, just to build that. And your budget is really key here. Understand what you've budgeted within your project and what the key elements are that will fit into that resource cost. Unfortunately, that's a big thing in projects. Cost is a major thing. And then once you've got that, you've got your finances. Now, one of the things is really understanding your budgeting, your costs, what's that speed. Now, you will initially do that as part of your scope, but I would focus on your budget in real key details and understand what your costs are through how you're resourcing your hardware, and speak to your financial team saying, what is the overall budget of this project, and find a mechanism to manage the cost. Now, a lot of areas you have it automated within their internal systems. If you don't, a manual spreadsheet is really good. Will track your assets, track your resource, make sure timesheets are filled in. All those things you need to make sure how you're going to track your individuals through the team. And finally, once you've got all those things, do a kickoff meeting. Now, this is where you bring everybody together and say, okay, we've got the information, talk about the scope, align our goals, define the roles, review the project plan, and make sure that everybody's interacting. Make sure everybody's on the same page, make sure everybody agrees the plan. This is probably an opportunity. There may be some iterations of the plan, but ideally you shouldn't be at that stage. You are then clearly defining everybody's roles and responsibility with the project, what you expect of them, when to expect it, etc. So there's a clear expectation. And you've now run through your project plan saying, we estimate on a high level with your key milestones, your timelines, your dependencies, and your risks that you encounter. And if there's any budget requirements, you need to cover that, because if you are selling to a customer end, then you need to cover that. But finally, the biggest one I would say is encourage questions, solicit input, feedback from the teams to uncover any assumptions, anything you've guesstimated as part of your project, so that you can make adjustments. This is the time to get all your people and stakeholders together and say, we're delivering, when, time, budget, etc., who's doing what, and realign any misalignments of expectations within your projects or stakeholders. And then you progress forward and start to deliver your project. That concludes today's video. Thank you for listening. I hope you found it useful. If you did, please subscribe, leave your comments below, and hopefully see you on the next video.